welcome to my studio. So I've been reworking some of my older original paintings lately. I have plenty of old originals that have never sold. It's no fun keeping them up on my website anymore when I don't feel proud of them or that they represent my current skills. So that's why I've been going back and reworking some of them. Doing that has made me think about what specific things I do differently now from then, and I thought it might be fun to talk a bit about that in a video. I'm obviously far from perfect as an artist. So many others are so much more talented, both when it comes to technical skills and imagination, but it's still fun to think about things I've personally improved and my own personal progress. The paintings I've been reworking have mainly been from around 10 years ago, and there's definitely lots of paintings from around that time when I wouldn't change a thing about them. At that time I had already developed many of my favourite techniques and style choices. I think most artists start out just drawing and experimenting and trying lots of different styles before they eventually naturally settle into something that becomes their own style, and then they keep developing and refining that style. I thought I'd go through some of my style related things and techniques that I personally like, things that I think make my paintings look more interesting. This first thing is hardly even a style thing because it's so common, but I remember reading at one point that you're not supposed to use black when shading. You should use like blue or something else. And for some reason that really made an impact, and I practically never use black. Or if I use black for shadows, I use it mixed with something else, just to make a colour more dull or less bright. But the reason I mention this is because that thinking that way sort of developed into using unexpected colours for other things as well. Like I rarely use like natural skin colours, for example, and when I do, it's only when it makes like a nice contrast or complement to the surrounding colours. This is also related to using a limited palette, which is something I really like. Sometimes I use a completely or almost monochrome palette, but most often I use two contrasting colours and maybe a third colour for some details. I find this to be one of the best ways and easiest ways to make a painting look more cohesive and stylistically interesting. Even if you're not that technically skilled otherwise, I think using a limited palette is a really easy way to make paintings look more refined and professional looking, if that's what you're looking for. Another thing I've learned that makes a painting look a lot better is adding white highlights. It sounds obvious, but I didn't do it from the start. It really makes a painting pop and makes it look so much cleaner. It can really make the difference between a painting looking dull and boring and just looking like a really good painting. The most obvious thing is reflections in eyes, but I usually add a lot more highlights than that, and sometimes I also add a white outline to figures and things, especially on the side that catches the light. At the same time, you don't want to overdo the highlights, because if you add too many, it will probably just look a bit messy. For the longest time I used white acrylic for this. Acrylic isn't ideal for adding highlights to watercolour paintings, and this is probably one of my worst habits as an artist. I just hate wasting things so much that I don't buy anything new, and I would use like an inferior product for years and years before I actually try the proper thing, and I always discover it's so much better. But anyway, when I eventually started using gouache instead, that made such a big difference. It both looks better and it's a lot easier to work with. Although I mainly make watercolour paintings these days, drawing is really the basis of my work, and that's why my pictures tend to have very defined line work. This also comes from being very influenced by John Bauer since childhood. In my earliest paintings, the outlines were just pencil lines, but eventually I started filling them in At first I used the black fine liner pen for this, but eventually I started thinking it would look more fun if I used watercolour in a deeper shade of the surrounding colour to define the lines, and that's what I tend to do these days. For a while now I've been trying to make an effort to paint without using such defined lines, because it's a style I would like to get better at, but so far that's a bit of an exception. I very often draw a bright red line under the eyes that I paint. I don't remember when I started doing this or why, but I just think it makes the eyes stand out so much more. I actually do the same thing for my own makeup. I also very often draw these quite large, sort of curved, sloping eyes. I just like the look of them. I've learned that adding several highlights to the eye, or one long squiggly highlight instead of just one dot, will make them look even shinier and glassier. And what I usually do if the eye is big enough is add a gradient from the top down of the eyeball, and then I add the highlights. I tend to draw soft curved lines rather than sharp angles, especially when it comes to figures. It's like a very subtle version of the rubber hose animation style, which I'm a big fan of. I also often paint wavy hair that curves from side to side, especially in underwater scenes. And finally, in the vast majority of my paintings, I add at least one bright red detail. These things are pretty much all down to personal style, but I also wanted to talk about some more specifically technical skills that I've learned over the years, not just from these recent reworkings. One of the first things I remember really trying to get better at is filling up the paper. I remember this from my childhood, even when I would draw like a tiny thing in the middle of the paper and the teacher would be like, "You have all this paper, you don't have to stay within this tiny little part of it." I still struggle with this a bit, and I'm really impressed by artists who aren't constrained by the paper at all and draw scenes that are more or less cropped or figures that you only see a small part of. This is the reason I almost always make thumbnail sketches before starting a painting these days. That way I can play around with compositions that fill the paper and do any cropping before I start on the actual painting. Related to this is backgrounds. I definitely used to be lazy about backgrounds, often doing just no background or plain colour or something very simple. Although actually, as I was looking through the oldest pictures on my website, I think I'm being a bit harsh on myself. There are actually a few interesting backgrounds there. I do remember that I made a very conscious decision to focus on getting better at backgrounds sometime around 2014, and I'm still always trying to improve. And one of the things I've done while reworking these paintings recently is adding a bit more detail to the background. I think one of the most important things I've learned, and this is very much applicable to backgrounds, is to simplify things. When I was younger, I used to think of the idea of painting like a lawn or a field of grass, because you would have to paint every strand of grass, or like a tree because you'd have to paint every single leaf. I couldn't really wrap my head around how other artists could paint really elaborate backgrounds of things that in real life are really intricate and detailed. Of course, there are artists out there who do fill entire canvases with minute detail, but I realised more and more that what artists tend to do is to simplify things. I realised that I didn't have to paint every single piece of grass. Instead, I needed to think of ways to make intricate things into abstract shapes that suggest the thing I want to depict. In the same way that I stylize the figures I draw, I need to stylize the backgrounds as well, and it wasn't as obvious to me. One way I do this is to paint the background without drawing it first, to just use more or less undefined blobs or washes of paint, and perhaps add a little bit of detail to a few parts, like dots for leaves or a few simple lines for grass. The other thing is to simplify objects. For example, not think of a tree as lots of branches with lots of leaves, but just as a shape. Now, I'm far from perfect at this, but I'm much better than I used to be, mainly because I just changed the way I thought about it. One thing I've learned is that using the right materials can make a big difference. As I mentioned before, I have a tendency to just stick with what I have and not buy anything new until I've used the old thing up completely. And I already mentioned that I finally started using gouache for highlights instead of acrylics, for example. Using good paper makes a world of difference. I've always struggled with even colours and smooth transitions, but using good paper made that really easy. I mentioned this in my video about art supplies a while back, but I have to give huge thanks to one of my patrons who sent me this watercolour pad some years ago now. It's a major reason why I've been able to level up my skills quite a lot since. Something I realised and started to apply quite recently is that you just can't mix every colour with a set of primary colours. I used to think I was just bad at mixing colours because my purples and pinks always came out a bit murky and dull, but you really need special pigments for those really bright non-primary colours. I bought a tube of purple paint about 7 years ago, but only last year did I buy a pink one, actually two, because I was trying to find the best one. I also added washes of these new pink and purple shades over the dull ones in the paintings that I've been reworking. The main thing I've been doing though is adding depth, definition and detail. In the past my paintings have often been of similar value all over, which makes them look a bit washed out. This is something I'm still working on, but having more contrast and deeper colours and shadows makes paintings so much more punchy. The most important thing I've learned when reworking these old pictures is to not stop working on a painting when it looks good enough. If I keep working on it, putting in a lot more work and time and just refining it a lot more, it's going to look so much better. And I shouldn't forget to add all of those details that could give a painting a lot more impact. For example, adding dramatic clouds instead of just keeping the sky a plain colour. I think I probably could have made much more technically advanced paintings years ago, but I just didn't know that I could, so I settled for much less. I still have countless things to work on and improve, but the big takeaway from reworking these old paintings is don't think that you can't do better. Thank you for watching.